This is the Secure CyberConnect podcast with Jay Adamson and Warren Atkinson, where we're joined by information and cybersecurity, technology and talent acquisition professionals who share their journeys, unique perspectives and offer advice and guidance. Our topics on this episode will be the convergence of cyber and physical security and insider threat management and investigations. Today we're extremely pleased to be joined by Harris Schwartz. Harris is a distinguished security and risk executive with expertise spanning across corporate, information and cybersecurity. With a career dedicated to developing and implementing robust security risk and investigative programs, Harris has become a trusted advisor and a fractional CISO for clients across diverse sectors, including financial services, retail, pharmaceuticals, media, entertainment and healthcare. Harris held pivotal roles in leading organizations such as Wipro, Aon and Nippon Telegraph and Telephone NTT Security Advisory Services, where he spearheaded global executive risk and advisory, including virtual CISO offerings, where his leadership experience has also extended to senior security roles at Levi Strauss, Safeway Albertsons and the Walt Disney Company. Known for his expertise in constructing and advancing global security frameworks, Harris excels in areas such as cyber threat intelligence, data protection, privacy and insider threat management, and has also provided critical advisory services to executives in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries, focusing on physical and cyber security, insider threat and supply chain investigations. His extensive background underscores his commitment to safeguarding organizations against evolving security challenges. Harris, welcome to the Secure CyberConnect podcast, and thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you on the episode.
No, it's great to be here. All of the topics that you mentioned are certainly topics that I love to talk about. Of course, could talk for days about them, but I know we have to keep it short. So no, I'm very excited to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
No, that's brilliant. Myself and Jay have been really looking forward to today's discussion. And before we get into things, could you perhaps share with the audience a high-level overview of what we're going to be discussing today in terms of the topics?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, there's so many topics to talk about. I think, some of the topics that I love to talk about, are around insider threat, insider risk, creating those programs, the convergence of cyber and physical, has certainly come to the top of the list for a lot of people recently, especially with a lot of the threats that we're seeing, or, even around terrorism and those sorts of things like we had here in the United States, at the first of the year. But touching on how we mitigate all these risks, right? How companies can stay proactive, how they can be prepared, how they can be ready rather than being reactive, which, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that. And so how we really mitigate these risks, some ideas, some suggestions, some things that have worked for me, some things that have not worked. And then I think the other area is talking about advanced tech. There's so many different types of advanced technologies that are heading our way. And so we, again, have to think about, from the industry standpoint, we have to think about security. We have to think about privacy, and we have to think about data protection. Those are the three top subjects anytime we talk about new technology, new programs, new services, et cetera. And so I enjoy talking about all of that.
Yeah, that's good. And you offer a breadth of cross-sector experience, which I'm confident the audience and community are going to be appreciative of. And before we unpack all of that, could you share with us something that you're either proud of or excited about that isn't on your LinkedIn?
Yeah, I tried to make my LinkedIn as complete as possible. I'd say that, probably over the last, maybe 5-6 years, I get a lot of contact from younger professionals in the industry that are looking for, how can they navigate their career? They're new to cyber. Maybe they've been in cyber for a few years and they need mentoring. And so I enjoy helping other people. I enjoy, being able to guide younger professionals because they definitely need it. And so I'm happy to help where I can. So that is something that I've done. Like I said, over the last probably 5 or 6 years, I've probably mentored, somewhere in the 10 to 20 professionals. And some of them I'm still in contact with. They still reach out to me even after we've, completed our mentoring and whatnot. And it's just great to see, how they've progressed in their careers.
No, we commend you for your contributions to the industry. And I think when it comes to mentoring, the gift of giving is certainly rewarding as well. It allows you to reflect on your processes and the ways that you work.
Yes, definitely.
And do you mind sharing with us perhaps one significant challenge that you faced in your career that's influenced your perspective on cyber, Harris?
So, I thought about this, and, I think from an industry perspective, I'm going to make this not about me. I'm going to make it about the industry. I think that, one of the challenges that I faced, as a fractional CISO, even as a practitioner, in my many roles and things of that nature, is the fact that a lot of companies and organizations still don't have the basics. They're experiencing ransomware, they're experiencing data breaches, they're experiencing data loss, data exposure, et cetera. Even insider threat cases and things of that nature, because they don't have the basics. And so it is a challenge when you're working with a client or an organization and you're trying to impose on them that, hey, this is what you need to have in place. And a lot of them will say, well, we haven't been attacked yet, so why do we have to? I see it as a huge challenge, because we have to deal with those clients, those CIOs, CEOs, whoever it might be on the client side. That's kind of my challenge.
And look, let's obviously talk about, the convergence of cyber and physical security. We know they're becoming much more integrated, and the traditional boundaries between the two areas are merging more than ever. And it's clear that a more unified approach is required in terms of risk management, and making sure that, everybody's more than aware of how to, ensure there are more comprehensive security measures out there. Why is convergence on this so important? What are the key drivers of this, such as within OT or IoT, for example?
I mean, it's interesting because, in most organizations, you likely are going to have a physical security or corporate security department, and you're going to have an information or cybersecurity department. And, both are charged with protecting the business, right? And aligning business needs with the security program. So that's all consistent. But when it comes down to, let's say, an incident, all of those people are have a place at the table, right, during the incident and whatnot. And then a lot of times, in my experience, corporate security is off doing something, cyber is off doing another thing, but then at the same time, they're doing the same thing. And they're reporting it separately. They're not reporting it together. They're not working together. There's a silo in place. And I just think that, I've seen a small percentage of companies change in that realm where they're actually working together, they're collaborating, they're working together and that type of thing. But I think there's still a lot of those silos out there, unfortunately.
Right. Makes sense. And what would you say the sort of the main benefits are for this? And of course, on the flip side of that, what are going to be the main challenges that many organizations are going to face with the sort of cyber physical convergence?
Well, I think that, again, if I use an incident as an example, so they've had a major incident, whether that be a business continuity incident, a cyber incident, where in a lot of cases, cyber incidents could cross over to the physical side or vice versa, right? The event starts on a physical security side and ends with, let's say, hacktivism and that sort of thing. I think that, the benefits of working together is obviously the collaborative nature, having a consistent story to the executives, right? If you have physical security that's reporting one thing and you've got cyber reporting something else, and it doesn't fit together, that's not going to be positive, let's say, right? Somebody's going to call that out and say, why aren't you working together? Why aren't you sharing information? Because again, you find, not to get into the deep about this, but you find that physical security, let's say they've got threat intelligence monitoring and you've got cyber that's got threat intelligence monitoring, but they're not working together. They're not sharing that information. So I think that, if they were, you'd have a better picture. You'd have a consistent picture, a consistent message to the executives that everything is being covered, right, during this particular incident.
We're getting a lot of this, and I mean, how do organisations prepare and adopt their best practices? Is it optional anymore for businesses even?
I don't think it's optional. I think in some of my experiences, I remember where the head of corporate security would say, "Well, we're going to run with this particular incident, even when it contained cyber issues and things." And then, of course, the CISO. No, we're taking control of this, and you're going to have to report to us, and you're going to have to work with us. And that just doesn't work. Now, if I take as an example at Levi Strauss, we had the Super Bowl one of the years that I was at Levi Strauss, obviously at Levi Stadium, right? But there were other activities that were going on from a business perspective in San Francisco. And it was great because cyber had a good relationship with physical, and we both worked together, and it was great. It was collaborative, right? We were on top of it. At the same time, it wasn't like corporate was getting, certain information and we were left in the dark, right? We all had the information at the same time. We were able to make plans together, strategies together, in reducing crime and reducing other issues that could happen, right, in like a street fair type environment, that type of thing. So, it does work. It really does work. I think I'll just say one other thing. I think that in the past, and I don't, it probably same now, egos get in the way, and there's really no place for egos, right? We kind of need to let those walls down. Everyone has a strength and a weakness, right? That's what makes a great team. So really, removing those walls and restrictions and things and really working together, I think is the way to go.
That's brilliant. And, if our audience isn't aware, you've actually wrote a book back in 2019 during your time at NTT, for instance, and the subject and the topic, of course, was threat investigation and risk management insights. We obviously recognize that insider threat investigation is a crucial component of any organization's overall security strategy in terms of protecting both assets and protecting against reputational damage. So why does that matter? Why is it so important to you, Harris, and why should that be important to organizations as well as our listeners? And what are the key types of insider threats that organizations are typically looking out for?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think, the topic of insider threat has been around for a very long time. Years, not even years, longer than that. And I think that there's, again, some organizations that want to look the other way. A large part of insider threat actually pertains to what we're calling now human risk. And it's really about, what we used to call it the negligent insider. Long time ago, that's what we called them. But now, it's about human risk, right? It's about making mistakes. Maybe they're not trained properly and that type of thing. And some of the industry statistics on this is about, I think the most recent one I saw said something like 8% of your workforce is responsible for 80% of insider threat or human risk. So you have sort of that non-malicious individual or individuals in your work environment that are causing some of these incidents, right? That could result in a larger incident, like a data exposure, or a data breach or a compromise of accounts and things of that nature. But on the other side, I think that there's some organizations that tend to look the other way. They don't consider a non-malicious incident as something that needs to be reported or handled, which is interesting in itself. I think that, the book came from just years and years of conducting different types of investigations around insider threat, mostly of the criminal type, mostly of the nation state type in some organizations and things. So really, really egregious type of incidents and things. And I wanted to talk about, ways to mitigate some of that, suggestions, things of that nature. That was really the the realm of the book, so to speak. Different types of insider threat. Again, you've got your non-malicious, you've got your criminal, you've got your, could be a competitor, could be an attacker, right? That's made it inside your environment, stealing information. It could be a contractor, it could be an employee. Those are the types of insider threat that exist.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And would there be sort of a part 2 to the book in the coming years, do you think?
Yeah, so it's funny because a couple people have said, there must be other investigations that you've done. And yes, of course there has been.
Always.
Yes, always, always.
No, that's good. We're looking forward to that. And for those organizations that are perhaps considering conducting insider threat investigations, what are the key steps should they take, and what are their core objectives? Because I appreciate a starting point for organizations is a struggle. And of course, if you haven't got a starting point, you haven't got an end point.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. So, to put together an insider threat program, right? Just like anything in cyber or corporate security, right? You've got governance over how a program is going to work. And in most cases, just like in cyber, just like in physical, there has to be collaboration among your stakeholders. So various business stakeholders in the company, like your HR, your legal, your physical security, your cyber, your risk management, if you have that, executive leaders, things of that nature. They all have to have a seat at the table. There has to be buy-in from everyone. There has to be support from everyone. And then, of course, you have to have policies. You have to have procedures in order to, be able to, in order to implement your insider threat program, just like any other program, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And following on from that, we know one of the most critically important things for all organizations is the ability to stay ahead of the game on profiling bad actors. Now, this obviously requires high levels of technical expertise and lots of continuous learning and development. So with that in mind, what are the typical types of bad actors, and what are the sort of key considerations and characteristics that organizations and individuals need to know about them?
Yeah, so profiling of bad actors can come from a couple different angles. One, and this is from experience working at a particular company, they suffered a distributed denial of service attack. Certain individuals were identified as being the origin of that attack, and the company was interested in understanding who they actually were, where they were physically located, so that they could take legal action. To most layman's, looking at something like that where you only have a username from a chat, people would look at it like, how am I going to know who that is? So there's something called, open source, right? If you know where to look, right? There are ways to identify, these folks and stuff like that. And that's exactly what had happened in that particular case. I was able to identify all of the individuals. The company took legal action, actually sent people to their homes. I mean, it was, quite interesting. From a general threat intelligence perspective, companies, there are companies. I remember like in pharmaceutical and biotech, especially with some of the special interest groups, some of the, environmentalists or animal rights extremist groups, the anarchist groups, even the ones teetering on domestic terrorism. The companies are interested in knowing who those groups are, who are the key players of those groups, what are their tactics, right? So that when it comes to building plans to mitigate some of that threat, maybe they have an event coming up and they know that XYZ organizations are going to be showing up. Well, they could probably say, yeah, well, the head guy is probably going to be there. These are going to be some of their tactics that they're going to do or perform. So, we need to kind of get ahead of the game on that, right? So it only helps out from a mitigation perspective to understand, what are the tactics, what's the modus operandi of, some of these groups and individuals and things, so that you're prepared. Not to say that you're going to stop it altogether, but at least you're going to have good information as far as how you could mitigate, that risk.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, what are the sort of some of the challenges, other challenges that organisations face in profiling these bad actors? What are some of the strategies that can be used to manage these threats?
Well, I think that, certainly if, I mean, there's a lot of third parties out there that are providing threat intelligence. And part of that is they provide, threat profiling on these different groups. There might be, let's say an organization has had, sort of advanced threat activities from a particular individual that have gone deeper than what you actually know. So you might be doing extra work to gather information about that person. I don't know if I want to go into that right now.
Okay, fair enough.
And are there any emerging trends that you're seeing in terms of bad actors and their profiling as we move into sort of 2025?
Yeah. So, you've got threat actor groups, right? You've got individuals that are coming together. A lot of them are committing ransomware or, other types of attacks and things like that. As far as, infrastructure that's being used, for criminal purposes or for these cyber attacks and things of that nature, I think is going to continue. I think, the government has done some, positive work in taking down some of these infrastructures, these crimes as a service or attack, basically blank as a service, whatever you're trying to attempt. Right. I think that, threat actors sort of range in the types of people, because you still have kids, 12 to 15, 12 to 16-year-olds that, they have some experience, but they don't have the infrastructure. So they go and they use, these infrastructures that cost you like, $10 a shot, launch your attack against XYZ and that type of thing. And then you still have your advanced individuals that, there's been some stories out there about individuals that were, working for corporations. They couldn't find a job, so they decided to turn to the bad side. And now they're, launching these, ransomware attacks and other things. And then you still, of course, have state-sponsored or nation-state attackers, certain countries that, are constantly attacking, the United States and certain entities within the United States. You're going to continue to have that.
And do different geographical regions typically have sort of a purpose for those attacks? For instance, those at the APAC region, it might be with a focus on intellectual property and the theft as opposed to sort of the damage. How is that characterized across the globe from your perspective?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Certainly like Asia as an example, right? They tend to have, not to say a particular country, but they tend to have, pretty much everything that they need, but they also like to, copy everything else. And so, so intellectual property is definitely, it was actually interesting. I was talking to someone this morning actually from Hong Kong, and they were talking about some of the privacy issues, especially, in China or Hong Kong, and that a lot of companies now are being pushed to utilize Chinese companies rather than, let's say industry leading companies, which, sort of makes sense, right? Trying to keep everything in country.
Look, obviously, we want to talk a bit about cybersecurity as a core internet principle and circle back a little bit in terms of all the swathe of new tech that we know is coming our way. People of our age group, certainly myself and you, Harris, have obviously grown up in a world where we've seen a monumental change in the internet from its mainstream inception in the 90s through to the social media era of the sort of the 2000s and the more modern internet of the last 10 years or so in terms of cloud application and blockchain and, as we've just discussed earlier, IoT and of course the future in terms of AI. Do you think the internet's ready for this in terms of both system design and overall governance?
So, I'm gonna elaborate a little bit on this. Some people know that I started my career off when the public internet was born. So this is post ARPANET. ARPANET was kind of the the name of the internet, right? It was designed for information sharing between research organizations. I mean, that was the original intent of the internet. Then the public internet, was born to, allow people to communicate with each other, through different platforms and things of that nature. And so, of course, the internet was never built with security in mind at all. And it's only been, as we've moved through time and the evolution of the internet, that, the industry has identified that, oh, hey, we need to have some extra security protocols, or we need to do this, or we need to do that in order to protect information. I mean, this was not the original intent. So as we add more and more technologies and things, if you look at AI as an example, not everybody, but a large portion of companies and organizations across industries are embracing AI as the next best thing. There's a lot of talk about it, taking over certain jobs, making things easier for companies or organizations or teams in their daily jobs, right? And that's probably true, but I don't think the governance is there. There's no regulation in place. There's nothing in place. And this seems to be our issue, where we introduce these new technologies, but then there's not enough governance around it. And then we only find that, oh, look, there's an attack against, using AI, or there's, whatever. I think, we saw that with ChatGPT, where they've experienced already attacks within that application. But again, we still don't have, I think not most, but a lot of countries, including the United States, came out with a policy. I don't know what's happened to that policy, but a lot of companies, let's say, either, they create, like an acceptable use policy around ChatGPT or around AI. You certainly don't want to share sensitive data, right? Because, I wonder where it's going. It's only going to, educate the language model, right? And make it better. But who's seeing that information? That's a challenge for sure. I think some companies have outright blocked, the use of ChatGPT or AI as an example, because they're afraid that, there will be misuse of that technology.
Yeah, it feels like we're at the foot of the mountain with AI and certainly a lot of connected devices with terms of governance, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to seem like I'm against it. I'm certainly not against new technologies, but I think that we have to wrap our minds around it. We have to have proper governance around it. We have to have proper regulation around it.
Are there any other areas of technology? We've covered quite a bit there that we may need to sort of look out for in this hyper-connected world that we're hurtling towards at a rate of knots.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the implementation of 5G, so you may have seen some of the recent articles and recent advisories from various government organizations, especially here in the United States, talking about the threat against cell phone communications and text messaging and stuff like that, and basically pushing citizens to use end-to-end encrypted services, right, to protect that, sensitive communications, And so, like, if you look at the protocol, right, it's called SS7, which is a protocol that around telecommunications, I mean, it's had security problems for years, but here we are still using it, right? Still having its issues.
I think 5G in this country is so decrepit and underinvested in, Harris, that honestly, security is probably one of the last things we need to worry about. I'd just take a good signal at the moment, to be fair, before I started worrying about security on this particular issue. I mean, 5G and
yeah, sorry. Yeah, we've had our own. It's actually interesting because I've got T-Mobile, and the other day, like, I had no cellular coverage. I actually where I live, I actually have really good 5G, but I woke up and I had no cellular service, and I called T-Mobile and I'm like, Well, what's going on? Oh, we're doing maintenance on the network. Well, how about notifying your client first to let them know? Like, I had no cellular service. It was crazy. Yeah, there's all kinds of new technologies, new advanced technologies, quantum computing, right? AI, of course, 5G. Also, you have to think about the evolution of ransomware. That's only going to evolve, even more than it is today. And then supply chain, of course.
Lots to look forward to.
Yes, yes, of course. Lots to look forward to. Yes.
So, Harris, from your perspective, what strategies can recruitment teams use to increase diversity, as well as ensuring that the hiring process is an inclusive one?
So, it's a very interesting subject, especially here in the US, because if I look back several years, a lot of companies were looking for more diverse candidates. They were using certain questions during the recruitment process to try and identify diverse individuals, even in their HR practices and things, right? They were trying to get employees to identify themselves as, let's say, LGBTQ, so that they knew, how many LGBTQ they had in their in the workforce, right? And then try and target those folks, right? Again, people know people, right? Hey, I know Johnny and he would love to work here, so why not try and recruit him, right? Because he's got the experience. The issue today, certainly on the political front, a lot of companies are now removing their DEI practices. So I think that piece of it is going to make it a lot more difficult, unfortunately. I think that when it comes to individual leaders, there's nothing wrong with trying to recruit diverse individuals. It's actually an interesting subject as well, because a lot of the folks that I have mentored run into these problems, but from a negative perspective. So they are labeled as, gay, lesbian, that type of thing. And then they're targeted by other employees, and then they want to leave that company. So of course we don't want that either. Of course, on one side of the coin, if I look at some of my experiences that I've had through the years, when somebody tries to use the fact that I'm gay against me, I always come back with a comment of, well, that has nothing to do with my job, right? That has nothing to do with my skills, my ability to do the job. So we are faced with that. I think it just takes leaders that are open, that are comfortable working with lots of different people. They're open to expanding their teams with diverse people.
That's a big challenge a lot of organisations are facing here in the UK as well. And from your perspective, how can we create a more supportive and equitable environment?
Yes, exactly. I think that, the companies that have, what they call employee resource groups, I think are companies that, someone that has a diverse background would want to target as far as trying to get a job there, because it shows that the company is certainly interested and, wants to promote diversity and inclusion, with different, I want to call it classes of people, but classes of people essentially, right? And they have activities and events and things of that nature where they support that particular employee resource group, where, there might be even additional materials and education around that particular diversity group. Those are the companies that are certainly ahead of the game.
So do you think that organisations perhaps look to external resource and consultancies to help them in those transitional phases?
Yes, no, I think that's positive as well. I mean, let's say a company doesn't have a particular ERG for LGBTQ, but they are getting a lot of requests, right, from employees that are looking, for that type of resource or that type of support. Yeah, and there's plenty of external consultants and things of that nature, even in companies that have an established ERG for, whatever group. I've seen companies actually use external consultants to come in and provide, their thought leadership around, the particular subject.
No, that's brilliant. And on that external support, you've obviously led virtual CISO practices for a number of high-profile organisations as well as yourself. For our audience, can you perhaps define what a vCISO is and why it's important in this day and age?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, vCISO is basically a virtual CISO, which that particular term has transformed into what we call fractional services. I mean, a vCISO in my experience, so like back at NTT Security, I built out a global virtual CISO program for clients. And so that back then it was still fractional, right? It wasn't full time, it was part-time, a part-time effort for that particular client, but we were the, let's say CISO for that organization, even though it was on a part-time basis, because they just didn't have, a CISO. A lot of those were small, medium-sized businesses or mid-sized market, type companies, and they just didn't focus on security, but they needed to. There's been a lot of articles recently just talking about the need for fractional work. And it's not just fractional CISO work, it's fractional CIO, fractional CEO. Again, a lot of the SMBs and the mid-market size companies are in need for, having someone on a fractional basis, part-time, a few hours a week, a few hours a month, just so that they have someone that they can talk to.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to get that enterprise grade expertise at a cost effective price, as opposed to having to go out to the big six or big four, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the last part of my career has really been within consulting. The thing I like about that is working with a diverse group of, I use diverse group of clients, different industries, things of that nature. But at the end of the day, they all need the same thing. They need a trusted advisor. They need someone that can help them with, whether it be compliance readiness, or they're implementing a project, or they just have a question, about something that they're trying to do, or there's a challenge in the workplace. They don't know how to deal with it. I like building relationships with clients, and, and I still have relationships with past clients that, we stay in touch and that type of thing. I think the ability to help people, to help clients, I think really has driven, myself, especially working, in consulting or, fractional CISO work.
And how can tech leaders use their technical expertise to add value in a commercial or investment landscape, Harris?
Yeah, of course. You actually see this a lot with C-suite and with boards at for a particular company, right? They don't necessarily understand the technical aspects of things. They don't understand, the in-depth discussions around technical issues or ransomware, or, that type of thing, right? And so the best thing to do is to make it easy for them to understand, in layman's terms. Always. I mean, because I've seen situations in the past where I'm sitting there listening to someone else talk about something very technical, and people are just like, like, what does that mean?
The 1,000-mile stare.
Yeah, totally. And I think that people like myself, or even technical leaders and things of that nature, when you're talking to executives, you really have to make it easy for them to understand. I'll say that, back at one of the consulting companies that I worked for, we actually had a legal team. This was a client's legal team. They wanted to understand ransomware better. They wanted to do a tabletop exercise, but they didn't understand anything about the technical nature of ransomware, of what happens during ransomware, the different steps and things of that nature. And so what we did was we actually walked them through what ransomware is, right? But very incremental, explaining things along the way, but then really aligning themselves to the business decisions that they have to make along the way. In that purpose, they completely understood what we were talking about. So I think you have to provide some context, to align, right?
Absolutely. So look, we've covered some really fascinating stuff today, and we appreciate the insight. Finally, sort of what does the future hold for you?
I want to continue doing fractional work. I just enjoy the work. One particular client that I'm working for, we literally just completed readiness exercises, which was a huge undertaking for an ISO certification. now we have to get ready for the audit. But yeah, I want to continue working with clients, working with people and, helping out wherever I can.
And if obviously any of our listeners want to stay connected beyond this podcast and beyond the community platform, where else can they reach out to you?
Just on LinkedIn, and then I've got an email address. They're always happy to do that. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, they can surely send out a connection request. I'm happy to connect.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you. We appreciate this, everything you've given us insight into today, Harris, and I'm sure the community, all our listeners, as always, will have found a great deal of value in the session. To continue the discussion for more sustained engagement, we invite you to join the Secure Cyber Connect community, where we're offering a range of collaborative solutions for both technology and security professionals at no cost. As before, on all our episodes, these include expansive community access, cross-sectional mutual mentoring programs, online networking sessions, and a range of exclusive interviews, panel discussions, and masterclasses coming up throughout 2025. If you want to know more, gain access to the community and any of our initiatives, please visit secure-recruitment.com/cyber-connect/. Thank you very much.
If you're struggling with cultural, technological, or talent acquisition challenges, reach out to the Secure Cyber Connect team, where we offer advice and guidance, and we're here to help.